This is Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It ranks third in the world for wealth per adult, behind only Switzerland and the US. Can you believe that 3.1% of the world's millionaires call Australia home? It's hardly a surprise considering that in 2023, Australia had the 13th largest economy by nominal GDP. Covering nearly 8 million square kilometers, it's the largest country in Oceania and the 6th largest in the world. Australia is also a leading exporter of natural resources like iron ore, coal and gold. And let's not forget extraordinary biodiversity, with unique species like kangaroos and koalas that exist nowhere else on Earth. But beneath this wealth and beauty, there's a darker reality lurking. 40 years ago, Australian scientist Dr. Tom Beer sounded the alarm about an impending catastrophe. Sadly, his warnings were ignored. Now, Australians are paying the price, suffering through deadly bushfires, floods, earthquakes, and sinkholes. Is there still time to prevent this looming disaster? And who do scientists hold responsible for the crisis unfolding before us? The Hidden Discovery team has unearthed shocking revelations. Stay with us until the end to find out who's behind the destruction of Australia. Number 10. New South Wales Bushfire. Look at this video. This is not a scene from the new Mad Max movie. This is the New South Wales state in Australia. In November 2019, the state suddenly found itself in the grip of an unprecedented bushfire crisis. At one point during the day, more than 90 fires were burning in the state. The fires cast an ominous orange glow over large areas of eastern New South Wales, and some locals described the scene as apocalyptic. But why it happened? The state has been plagued by severe drought, and while some parts of New South Wales celebrated rain over the weekend, it was not widespread enough to mitigate the damage done by months of historically poor rainfall, making this fire season more dangerous than usual. New South Wales authorities told local media that almost 1,200 firefighters and 70 aircraft had been deployed to save as many people as possible, with around 92,000 people affected by the fires. At least 100 homes were destroyed by the fire, and more than 30 people were injured. Such incidents are not a new thing here in Australia. On the 7th of February 2009, one of Australia's all-time worst bushfire disasters started in the state of Victoria. The fires occurred during extreme bushfire weather conditions and resulted in Australia's highest ever loss of human life from a bushfire, with 173 fatalities. 41,100,000 acres of land burnt. Many people were left homeless and lost their families as a result. The consequences of the fire were so devastating that people called that day Black Saturday. The saddest thing is that it could have been prevented. Back in 1986, Dr. Tom Beer, who was working as a meteorologist looking at bushfires, was asked by his boss to go and find out what the greenhouse effect might mean for the future of fires. Beer's findings in 1987 shocked the scientist so much that he published them under the title Danger of Forest Fires in Australia During Climate Change. It was the first study in the world to ask what climate change would mean for wildfires. Watch this video to the end to find out what Dr. Beer discovered. Bushfires kill animals directly and destroy local habitats, leaving survivors vulnerable even after the fires pass. In the 2019 to 2020 bushfires, over 1 billion animals are estimated to have died in Australia. Many animals were burnt to death, while others succumbed later due to the loss of food, shelter, and predation by feral cats and foxes. Australia has the highest rate of species loss globally, with fears that some native species, like the kangaroo island dunnart, may face extinction. A 2020 study from the Australian government revealed that 272 plants and 55 threatened animal species had significant portions of their known distribution impacted by the fires. Species like koalas, being slow-moving, are particularly vulnerable, while faster animals like kangaroos also perished as they tried to outrun the flames. Some animals, like wombats and snakes, managed to survive by burrowing underground. The fires also severely impacted Australia's unique flora, with 11 bioregions and 17 major native vegetation groups severely burnt. Many species that rely on fire for regeneration were affected, with unprecedented damage to Australia's rainforests and eucalypt forests. Meanwhile, bushfires are not the only disaster that threatens Australia. Now think a bit and give an answer to a question. Which natural disaster caused the most damage to Australia in 2022? A. Cyclone. B. Earthquake. C. Flood. D. Bushfire. Patiently watch the video till the end to find out the correct answer. Number 9. Northern Australia flood. Australia is a land of opportunities. Opportunities like being eaten by a crocodile during a flood. That's exactly what happened in Cairns, a city of over 150,000 people known as the gateway to the Great Barrier Reef. The city has been almost completely cut off by torrential rains brought by the remnants of Tropical Cyclone Jasper in December 2023. The floodwaters that engulfed the city turned out to be tricky. It turned out they were teeming with snakes and crocodiles, who seemed to be quite enjoying the disaster. In early 2023, Northern Australia was hit by some of the most devastating floods in its recent history. Torrential rains fueled by tropical cyclones and prolonged monsoonal weather caused rivers across the Northern Territory and parts of Queensland to burst their banks, leaving entire communities submerged and isolated. The Victoria River and other major waterways swelled to unprecedented levels, inundating towns like Daguragu, Kalkarinji, Pigeonhole, and Palumpa. Roads were washed away, homes were destroyed, and over 700 residents had to be airlifted to safety as floodwaters continued to rise. Evacuees were relocated to Katherine and Darwin, where they were provided with temporary shelter. Many locals expressed frustration over the delayed response from authorities, criticizing the lack of early action that could have prevented further chaos. But it wasn't just the floodwaters that posed a threat. As the rivers expanded and flooded the land, crocodiles and snakes were spotted in the murky waters, adding a terrifying layer of danger to the already devastating situation. Residents reported seeing crocodiles drifting through the flooded streets, while snakes slithered through the water, seeking refuge. These animals, displaced by the floods, seemed to thrive in the chaos, posing a real risk to those stranded in the affected areas. The floods also wreaked havoc on the region's cattle industry, washing away vast pastures and leaving livestock stranded or drowned. The disruption to food supplies and damaged infrastructure made recovery efforts even more challenging. Many communities remained isolated for days, relying on emergency airlifts for essential supplies. The 2023 Northern Australia floods highlighted the vulnerability of the region to extreme weather events, which are becoming more frequent and intense due to climate change. With unpredictable weather patterns and increased rainfall, Northern Australia faces ongoing risks, and the presence of wildlife such as crocodiles and snakes in the floodwaters only emphasizes the deadly nature of these natural disasters. And now we move on to the next inevitable catastrophe threatening Australia, so stay tuned. Number 8. Severe Tropical Cyclone Ilsa. On the 13th of April 2023, Cyclone Ilsa crossed Badut Island in the Timor Sea off Western Australia's remote north coast. Extensive damage was done to the entire island, with all coastal vegetation stripped clear from the island's surface. About 80 to 90% of the island populations of 3 seabird species were killed in the storm. Scientists warn the frequency and intensity of such storms are likely approaching a threshold beyond which Badut's seabirds cannot readily recover, with cyclones hitting the island on average every 7 years in recent decades. Cyclones are the most destructive weather systems affecting Australia, especially for coastline bounded by the tropical waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The main hazards associated with tropical cyclones are intense winds and heavy rain, and in coastal areas, storm surges can also have devastating impacts on wildlife, vegetation cover, and human infrastructure. Low-lying islands commonly found throughout the tropics are refuge to unique and often threatened species. Yet these habitats, including mangroves and fringing reefs, can be significantly damaged by cyclones, even when the storm is more than 800 kilometers away. On 12 April, the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in Australia issued a cyclone yellow alert and urged residents to be prudent and to take action and prepare to shelter. At least 700 residents were being evacuated to cyclone shelters before the storm. Port Hedland Mayor Peter Carter said damaging winds could turn flying debris into missiles in the air. On April 15th, the storm was over. Australia's emergency department started assessing damage from a tropical cyclone that hit the northwest of the state. For example, one of the most favorite Australian runabouts, the Pardue Roadhouse, sustained major damage valued at $4 million Australian dollars. The tavern was completely wiped out by the storm. Workers said it was 4 hours of hell. On average, 11 tropical cyclones form or enter Australia's waters every year. However, the frequency and intensity of tropical cyclones is increasing worldwide. If Australians don't listen to the scientists, the hell-like hours will increase. As a result of the damage associated with the storm, the name Ilsa was removed from the list of Australian region cyclone names and will never be used again for a tropical cyclone in that basin. It was replaced by Isabella for future seasons. Floods, bushfires, stormy weather. This is just a partial list of the disasters plaguing Australia. Let's keep moving forward. Number 7. Melbourne Earthquake. On May 28, 2023, at 11:41 p.m. local time, the Greater Melbourne region was shaken by a magnitude 4.0 earthquake. More than 25,000 people reported they felt this earthquake, some as far as Hobart, which is 620 kilometers away from the epicenter. In the Melbourne region, the earthquake reportedly produced shaking, which lasted roughly 10 to 20 seconds, according to witness reports on social media. It was followed 2 minutes later by a magnitude 2.8 aftershock, which was reported by some people in the epicentral region between Sunbury and Craigieburn. Geoscience Australia senior seismologist Jonathan Bathgate said the earthquake was the latest in a series of aftershocks from the 2021 magnitude 5.9 quake that struck the town of Mansfield. This is a part of that aftershock sequence, and it is possible that there will be others to follow, he told Seven's Sunrise program. Elodie Borleys from the Seismology Research Center said there were no reports of damage from the latest earthquake, and the increase in tremors across the state was normal. There's been no reported damage so far. People have just reported feeling it and hearing it, she told. Earthquakes in Australia occur as a result of stresses at our surrounding tectonic plate boundaries, where different plates collide, grind past one another, or are being forced apart. These stresses make their way towards the middle of the plate too. In Southeast Australia, the forces at the Pacific Australian plate boundary to the east, the same plate boundary which passes through Aotearoa, New Zealand, produce a buildup of strain. This is eventually released in the form of earthquake ruptures at weak zones or faults in the crust. As a result of all this, earthquakes occur in the Greater Melbourne region about once a month. Many of these, typically more than 3/4, are too small to be felt. If you are Australian or have ever been there, tell us in the comments, have you encountered an earthquake? The Hidden Discovery team will be happy to read your stories. And we move on to the next disaster. Number 6. Umpherston Sinkhole. What we are going to talk about now looks more like a miracle than a disaster, but only because nature has the ability to restore itself if it is not spoiled by the human hand. The Umpherston Sinkhole in Mount Gambier, South Australia, is unlike any other. Normally, sinkholes cause damage, destruction, and can leave a scar on a city. This, however, is a beautiful secret garden oasis. The sinkhole was once a typical limestone cave that formed by the corrosion of limestone rocks by seawater waves, and the sinkhole was naturally created when the chamber's roof collapsed. The sinkhole was made into a garden by James Umpherston in 1886. The sinkhole is open from dawn to dusk, and as the sun sets, the Umpherston Sinkhole comes alive with hundreds of possums as they come into this tranquil garden to feed. The Umpherston Sinkhole has a long ramp at the entry point, followed by an array of enclosed steps. From these steps, you can see the first real views of the sinkhole. As you proceed further into the sinkhole, you will be able to see the stunning garden and its picturesque landscape. From the area of this sinkhole, you can see the terraces in the garden. Once you descend to the floor of the sinkholes, you will see the fountain, hydrangeas, and tree ferns around the area. But don't forget that sinkholes are incredibly dangerous. One of the most alarming aspects is their sudden collapse, often occurring without warning. Sinkholes appear when the ground beneath the surface is eroded by water, dissolving soluble rocks such as limestone, gypsum, or salt beds. Over time, this creates a void, and when the surface can no longer support its weight, it collapses, forming a sinkhole. When the ground unexpectedly gives way, it can cause buildings, roads, and infrastructure to crumble, putting human lives at serious risk. These collapses can be deep and vast, leading to severe injuries or even fatalities if people or vehicles fall into them. Beyond the immediate threat to life, sinkholes can wreak havoc on essential services like water lines, sewage systems, and gas pipes. The damage to these systems can result in contamination, flooding, and in some cases, even explosions. Moreover, sinkholes present environmental hazards by altering landscapes and ecosystems. When they expose underground aquifers, there is a serious risk of water contamination, which can affect entire regions. Don't switch, and the Hidden Discovery team will tell you about the hole that the Australian authorities couldn't handle. Number 5. Perth Bushfire. This is Johan Catherine, citizen of Perth in Western Australia. He and his partner lost everything they had. Their home has been destroyed and left turned upside down by a massive fire that's torn through Perth's northeast. In the end of November 2023, the blaze began deep in forest and quickly spread towards suburbia, fanned by strong winds and extreme heat. Johan conceded they did not initially take the fire threat seriously. "We did take it lightly. People have offered to help us to pick things up, and we said no, we'd be all right," he told. The blaze, the largest the city has seen in years, has burnt through 9,000 hectares, destroying 71 homes. 6 firefighters have suffered injuries. The Wooroloo fire, as locals called it, had a 100-kilometer perimeter and was burning about 30 kilometers east of central Perth. In addition to leaving people without homes, such fires are extremely harmful to the health of Australians. Smoke from wildfires could be a surprising new route for the spread of infections, according to research. Scientists say that microbes and fungi can survive in large numbers in smoky plumes. They believe it's likely that organisms from the soil, known to cause infection, could be transferred in this way. Scientists argue that greater monitoring of wildfire smoke by health authorities is urgently needed. But we should not forget that not only people suffer from fires. More than 61,000 koalas and almost 143 million other native mammals were likely in the path of the Australian bushfires of late 2019 and early 2020. Bushfires are harmful and dangerous for Australia's future because they destroy vast areas of natural habitat, threaten biodiversity, and contribute to climate change by releasing massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. As bushfires become more frequent and intense, they endanger communities, wildlife, and the stability of Australia's ecosystems. Number 4. New South Wales floods. Do you remember our question? Which natural disaster caused the most damage to Australia in 2022? A. Cyclone. B. Earthquake. C. Flood. D. Bushfire. Well, the correct answer is C. Flood. In early 2022, Australia witnessed one of its most devastating natural disasters in recent history, the catastrophic floods that swept across Queensland and New South Wales. Torrential rainstorms caused by a severe weather system associated with the La Niña phenomenon led to widespread flooding that inundated vast regions, leading to loss of life, widespread displacement, and significant economic damage. In Australia, La Niña often results in heavier than usual rainfall, particularly in the eastern parts of the country. In early February 2022, these weather conditions triggered torrential downpours that lasted for days, overwhelming rivers and causing them to break their banks. Queensland was the first to feel the brunt of the storm system, with cities like Brisbane and Gympie experiencing relentless rainfall. Major rivers, including the Brisbane River, swelled to dangerous levels, causing water to flood homes, businesses, and entire neighborhoods. Soon after, the storm system moved south, hitting New South Wales with similar intensity. The northern city of Lismore was particularly hard hit, with residents forced to take refuge on rooftops as floodwaters rose rapidly. The human toll of the 2022 Queensland and New South Wales floods was immense. Hundreds of homes were submerged in Western Sydney, causing trouble for 50,000 people, with tens of thousands being displaced. A cargo ship called the Portland Bay went missing for 2 days straight and was on the verge of shipwreck before it was finally rescued and eventually towed to Sydney. In Brisbane, the city's extensive flood defense infrastructure was overwhelmed. The heavy rains caused flash flooding that quickly engulfed suburban streets, leaving people trapped in cars and houses. The floods also resulted in extensive damage to roads, bridges, and public infrastructure, compounding the challenges faced by rescue operations. Thousands of homes were destroyed, and countless businesses faced immense losses. Agriculture, a key industry of the region, was heavily affected as farmlands were submerged, livestock perished, and crops were ruined. As Australia moves forward, the floods underscore the urgent need to address the growing risks posed by climate change and to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable communities in the face of an uncertain future. Do you like this video? Like and subscribe so you don't miss more hidden discoveries from our team. Number 3. Tera Fire. Bushfires are often sparked by a combination of dry conditions, high temperatures, and strong winds, which create the perfect environment for fire to spread rapidly. One of the most common natural causes of these fires is lightning, which can ignite dry vegetation and set off devastating blazes. The residents of Tera, Queensland, saw this for themselves on the 22nd of October in 2023. Two large bushfires broke out, sparked by dry thunderstorms. Fueled by extreme heat, dry conditions, and strong winds, the fire rapidly spread across the region, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. As the fire grew in intensity, residents were given little time to react. Emergency services issued evacuation orders, urging people to leave their homes immediately. Despite the swift response, many homes and properties were lost to the fire, and the blaze forced hundreds of people to flee their homes. Several towns and rural properties in the area were engulfed by the flames, leaving families displaced and searching for safety. The Tera Fire also caused widespread damage to infrastructure, with power lines and roads affected, hampering rescue efforts. The rural nature of the area meant that firefighting resources were stretched thin as firefighters battled to contain the rapidly spreading flames. By the end of October 2023, Queensland saw over 1,000 bushfires, many of these sparked by dry thunderstorms. Several of these fires were significant, such as the Tara and Mount Isa fires, which burnt well over 40,000 hectares combined, destroyed 65 homes, and claimed the lives of 2 people. This season was the worst in 70 years. Small-scale burns at the right times of the year and in the right places can minimize the risk of big wildfires in drier times and are important for the health and regeneration of particular plants and animals. In the last 10 years, government licenses have been granted to fire prevention programs on Aboriginal lands in northern Australia. In this area, Aboriginal traditions, which reduce the undergrowth that can fuel bigger blazes, revolve around the monsoon. Land is burned patch by patch, using cool fires in targeted areas during the early dry season, between March and July. These defensive burning programs began in the 1980s and 1990s when Aboriginal groups moved back onto their native lands. Since this process began, destructive bushfires in northern Australia have burned 57% fewer acres in 2019 than they did on average in the years from 2000 to 2010, the decade before the program started. Number 2. Freemantle Sinkhole. In August 2022, Pia Ramsing was doing her daily walk around her property in Collie when she noticed the 8-meter-wide hole. "I was very shocked," she said. "I thought, wow, I could have gone in the hole if I had come yesterday to the same spot. I could have been buried alive." After the shock, Ms. Ramsing started investigating and discovered her land was actually on top of an abandoned mine from 1903, a fact no one told her when she purchased the 2.3-hectare property in April last year. Ms. Ramsing said she was then diverted around by different authorities before being told that no help would be available. The Mining Rehabilitation Fund did not have enough money to help people like Ms. Ramsing. Ms. Ramsing mentioned that the old mine responsible for her sinkhole had also caused others in the nearby state forest. She explained that there were 4 more sinkholes on the other side of the road and expressed concern about the school bus that travels on that road twice a day, as she feared it could fall into another sinkhole. This case clearly highlights that sometimes the government struggles to handle all the challenges nature throws its way. Of course, the cause of this sinkhole is entirely man-made. But now, the government is often forced to turn a blind eye to these incidents. So, what happens next? When fires and floods become more frequent, will the authorities still be able to help their citizens? Number 1. Dolphin Sands bushfire. It was a quiet morning in early February 2023 when the first whiffs of smoke began to drift across the azure waters of Tasmania's east coast. The skies over Dolphin Sands, usually so blue and clear, were beginning to cloud with an eerie gray. The locals noticed it at first with passing concern, but in a land where bushfires had always been more of a mainland problem, few believed this would come to much. By noon, the smoke had thickened, rolling in like a storm, heavy and ominous. The heat was unbearable that day, a searing reminder that even Tasmania wasn't immune to the warming climate that had been wreaking havoc across Australia. The news on her radio crackled with reports of a fire sparking near the outskirts of Dolphin Sands. Winds were gusting unpredictably, fueling the flames that were now racing toward the narrow strip of land she called home. The fire had begun quietly, as they so often do, a small flicker in the dry underbrush, ignited by a searing spark on a landscape parched by drought. But in a matter of hours, it had grown into a monster, its fiery tendrils spreading like a serpent's tail across the bushland. The firefighters had mobilized, but with the winds as wild as they were, it became a game of constant chase, the flames always just a step ahead. For days, the fire raged on, consuming everything in its path: bushland, homes, entire habitats. The community was tight-knit, and though the mood was somber, there was a sense of shared resilience. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the fire was not something they could entirely stop. They could only hope to contain it. In the aftermath, the landscape that had once been a lush coastal paradise was reduced to blackened earth. Large swathes of bushland had been scorched beyond recognition. The wildlife, which had thrived in these fragile ecosystems, had either fled or perished in the flames. The molting lagoon, home to countless species of birds and marine life, had not escaped the fire's wrath. The sight was heartbreaking, but somehow Dolphin Sands had been spared the worst. Thanks to the tireless efforts of firefighters, most homes were still standing, yet the cost had been heavy. The community would rebuild, but the memory of those terrifying days would not fade. As the people of Dolphin Sands began to pick up the pieces, they knew that this would not be the last fire. The climate was changing, and with it, the land they loved was becoming more vulnerable. The Dolphin Sands fire was a harsh reminder of the growing threat that loomed over all of Australia. Now it's time to talk about what scientists and Dr. Beer think about the disasters devastating Australia. Could this have been prevented? You'll find out in just a few moments. From his lounge in Brunswick, Melbourne, 72-year-old Dr. Tom Beer has been watching the fury of an unprecedented Australian bushfire season unfolding on his television screen. I feel sorry for the firefighters who've got extraordinarily tough jobs ahead, and it's only going to get tougher, says Beer. But I feel maybe I was not enough of a prophet crying in the wilderness. Back in 1986, Beer was working in the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, or CSIRO, as a meteorologist looking at bushfires. He was asked by his boss to go and find out what the greenhouse effect might mean for the future of fires. Beer's findings, published as Australian Bushfire Danger Under Changing Climatic Regimes, became the first study in the world to ask what climate change would mean for wildfires. Despite his efforts, Beer's concerns were largely forgotten as Australia experienced no major bushfires for another decade. This lull led to a decline in institutional interest at the CSIRO, where Beer was employed. After a few years, Beer shifted away from bushfire research. Dr. Beer retired from CSIRO in 2014, his warnings largely unheeded, while the bushfire crisis and droughts of the 2000s continued to reflect the very predictions he had made decades earlier. In 1988, the United Nations established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. Its mission is to assess scientific information related to climate change, its impacts, and potential adaptation and mitigation strategies. The IPCC is the world's leading authority on climate science and plays a crucial role in shaping global climate policies. Comprised of thousands of scientists and experts from around the world, the IPCC does not conduct its own research. Instead, it reviews and synthesizes the most current scientific data on climate change, drawing from peer-reviewed studies and research. Every few years, the IPCC releases comprehensive assessment reports, which provide a clear picture of the current state of the climate, the potential future scenarios, and the steps necessary to mitigate the impacts. The IPCC's findings have been instrumental in informing international agreements such as the Paris Agreement, where nations committed to limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Its reports highlight the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, transition to renewable energy sources, and adapt to the unavoidable consequences of a changing climate. Scientists warn that climate change is having a profound impact on Australia, leading to more frequent and severe bushfires, droughts, and floods. They stress the need to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from industries such as energy production, transport, and agriculture, which are the largest contributors to Australia's carbon footprint. To mitigate climate change, scientists advocate for a shift to renewable energy sources, improved energy efficiency, and sustainable land use practices. Scientists assert that energy production from fossil fuels needs to be reduced because burning coal, oil, and gas releases large amounts of greenhouse gases, driving climate change. Transitioning to cleaner energy sources is crucial to limit global warming and reduce harmful impacts on the environment and public health. Scientists have long known what is causing the destruction of Australia. The key is for Australians to learn to listen to them and take the right actions. Thank you for venturing on this journey through unexplored corners of Australia. What fact surprised you the most? We invite you to explore other hidden discoveries on our channel.